Este fin de semana, el presidente de la República anunció que El Salvador será sede de la próxima edición de Miss Universo. Una gran cosa que va a suceder dentro de nuestro país, que tenía pues muchísimas décadas de no suceder. Anteriormente El Salvador ya había formado parte de la organización de este evento, pero pues prácticamente desde mucho antes del conflicto armado y después del conflicto armado nunca habíamos tenido la oportunidad nuevamente de tener los ojos de todo el mundo sobre nuestro pequeño El Salvador. Y esta semana recién pasada también llegó a la Asamblea Legislativa pues una normativa de ley para poder consolidar el Bitcoin dentro de El Salvador y seguir convirtiendo El Salvador en el centro financiero no solamente de Centroamérica ni del continente, sino del mundo. Es así como grandes cosas están pasando en El Salvador, lejos pues en este momento de pensar tan siquiera en que ahora somos el país más seguro del continente, cosa impensable en el gobierno anterior. Prácticamente este gobierno ni siquiera termina y ha sido en esta gestión en la que El Salvador ha resurgido prácticamente dentro de las cenizas para darse a conocer en el mundo por el surf, por la seguridad, por su economía, por el Bitcoin precisamente, un país pionero prácticamente en esta moneda digital que pues prácticamente estaba a las puertas de convertirse en las reservas del mundo. Pero muy aparte de todas esas cosas muy positivas para todos los salvadoreños, hoy quiero contarles que, tal vez algunos ya han notado, pero muchos extranjeros ahora están migrando hacia El Salvador. Y no es algo que se los digo yo o en este video únicamente pues por querer hablar maravillas del país. Hay cosas que arreglar, por supuesto, hay muchísimas cosas todavía que hacer, pero ese es un fenómeno que no podemos pasar desapercibido como salvadoreños. Y es que incluso, uno de los países considerados en todo el continente como un país maravilla prácticamente para poder vivir, que es Canadá, ha provocado las últimas políticas de las últimas décadas que ahora canadienses migren y quieran vivir en El Salvador junto a sus familias y quedarse acá de forma permanente. Y de eso va a tratar este video. Particularmente entrevisté a 3 canadienses que han decidido hacer su vida ahora en El Salvador, han buscado un país que le ofrezca mayores libertades. Así como lo escuchan, un país incluso más libre que Canadá, El Salvador, de verdad, pues no se lo voy a decir yo, que se los digan ellos. Vamos a ver estos testimonios de canadienses que han decidido hacer El Salvador su nuevo hogar, partiendo de que en Canadá ellos han visto limitadas sus libertades, su democracia y el hecho de poder desarrollarse como seres humanos y han decidido, por todo lo que está sucediendo ahora en El Salvador, venir a vivir acá. En pocas palabras, de verdad, me impactó cada uno de los testimonios de ellos porque vivieron una situación que ningún salvadoreño, de hecho, incluso acá en El Salvador, hemos padecido. Son muy fuertes, de hecho, pues una situación que cuando tú te pones o intentas interpretar al menos la situación que ellos vivieron en el momento en el que ni siquiera podían comprar las cosas diarias, lo de su comida, ni siquiera, y todo esto por apoyar protestas en contra del mismo gobierno. Ellos vieron sus cuentas bancarias congeladas, no podían hacer uso de su propio dinero y pues vivieron restricciones en centros comerciales, no podían ir a restaurantes, no podían ir al cine, etc. Vieron su libertad amenazada y vieron su libertad pues prácticamente destruirse en un país que a ojos de los latinoamericanos en general, de hecho pues es uno de los tal vez mejores países. O eso es lo que creemos prácticamente, pero pues ¿quién mejor que alguien de esa misma nación para comentarnos qué es lo que realmente sucede? Y sin más, veamos el primer testimonio de Tom, que nos cuenta pues qué es lo que sucedió en Canadá y por qué decidió venirse a El Salvador, con su familia prácticamente.
What drives a Canadian to leave his country, a developed country?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that up until a few years ago, developing nations like Canada were a fantastic place to live for the most part. Although maybe I could see some things getting worse over time. It was still relatively free, and you could live your life the way you wanted to, and the economy was relatively strong, and there's lots of economic opportunity. But over the past few years, we just saw our freedoms get restricted so much, and we just really started to see the country heading downhill quickly. And so I can give you some examples of what I mean. Like, for us specifically, we chose not to get the COVID vaccine, and because of that, our family suffered a lot. Like, for instance, my wife lost her job as a nurse. We were banned from eating at restaurants, visiting like many indoor locations, even some outdoor ski hills and things like that absurdly banned us from entering. And so we were looking at possibly a long time where we wouldn't be able to take our kids to any activities. We would have to tell them that we couldn't take them to the swimming pool or gymnastics or the movie theater or out to lunch. And so it's kind of a depressing thought to live in a place like that. And, you know, to add add further insult to injury on that, the government then said that they were going to take away our right to travel on planes, boats, and trains. And so we would also be banned from leaving the country. And so there's all kinds of restrictions related to COVID that I just didn't think were okay in a supposedly free country. And shockingly to me, you know, for a country that in its national anthem says it's the true north, strong and free, Canadians didn't really stand up for their freedoms. They thought it was totally fine to discriminate against their fellow citizens and take away their rights and their basic freedoms. And so, you know, we were shocked by that, but we had to face reality, and we could see the trend or the direction the country was going in is very bad. And we also knew that if they could treat us that badly while we were still free to leave, you know, we thought, how bad could they treat us if we were locked in the country? And so we decided to leave. But there's actually something else I wanted to mention. So prior to the COVID-19 response from the government, we had been seeing some things happening in Canada that were scaring us. And one of those things is that, so there's a specific case of a man in Canada who was banned from, or who was sent to prison or jail anyways, for not affirming his 13-year-old daughter's decision to change her gender. And so he spoke out about this, and he refused to call his daughter his son, and he was sentenced to 6 months in prison or jail. I can't remember if it was prison or jail, but anyways, so he is out now pending an appeal, but like the fact that a country can take such extreme measures against someone for speaking their mind. This person hadn't done anything to harm anyone. He had just spoken his opinion about this, and so we could see ourselves potentially being in a position like that at some point in the future, and it was a really scary thought for us, and so that already kind of put the thought in my mind that maybe someday we would need to leave Canada. And so when the COVID measures started taking effect and our freedoms were being taken away, you know, it's not like it was a brand new thought for us that maybe we should think about leaving Canada, but it certainly accelerated quickly. Like we didn't even have our children's passports ready to go when, you know, we were in the middle of COVID, because we weren't expecting to be leaving anytime soon. We had little children and didn't want to leave, and we had a very good life. We were very happy living in Canada. We had a beautiful home and our kids in a great private school, and we had no reason to want to leave until basically it just became impossible to live there. Like our lives were just destroyed by the government. And the other thing I wanted to mention before I let you move on to another question is, so there was a lot of people watching might know of the Freedom Convoy in Canada that went to Ottawa. There was tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Canadians who traveled to Ottawa to protest against the government's restrictions on freedoms. And there was many people who donated to that peaceful protest. And people had their bank accounts frozen. People who protested, people who donated to the fundraiser had their bank accounts frozen. And so, like, if you can imagine not being able to buy groceries because of a $50 donation that you made to a fundraiser, it's pretty shocking. And so things like that, I mean, that actually happened after we'd left Canada already. We were in Mexico at the time, but all this other stuff happened before we left and caused us to leave. But I mean, that just sort of cemented the decision and made us realize, like, this is the right call, getting out of Canada.
So our next question is, why did you choose El Salvador?
Why did I choose El Salvador? Well, it wasn't our first choice, actually, like leaving Canada. We actually went to Mexico first. We left Canada October 27th of 2021, and we decided to go to Mexico because they had like the least COVID restrictions, and I had spoken to a few people who were living there and said life was great. And we were somewhat familiar with Mexico, having gone there once before, and so we spent 6 months there traveling around as tourists and exploring the country, and it was we actually really enjoyed our time there, but we were told that we couldn't apply for residency without going back to Canada, or that'd be incredibly difficult if we didn't go back to Canada. And so we basically said, well, it's not an option right now, so let's go travel somewhere else, and then we'll come back to Mexico and keep living there. We had no long-term plan, right? We were forced to leave and sell our house and pack up all our things in 3 weeks and leave the country before we were locked in. So you have to forgive us for not having any long-term planning. But yeah, so we booked, so we were looking for places to go, and I saw that El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, had dropped all the COVID-19 restrictions, the mask mandates, the vaccine mandates, or PCR tests, all that stuff. And I don't think they never had vaccine mandates, but the PCR tests and everything was dropped. And all of a sudden I went, hey, what if we go to El Salvador? Because there was not many countries, at least in the Americas, that had dropped that other than Mexico. El Salvador might have been the only other one. And so all of a sudden we were very interested. And then also Bukele had passed the Bitcoin legal tender bill, and me being a Bitcoiner became very interested. And so the combination of those two things was like, whoa, this is cool. We got to check this place out. And so I convinced my wife to come to El Salvador for 2 months to check it out. And we booked a flight here from Mexico and a return flight back to Mexico after 2 months. And we stayed here 2 months. We lived on the beach for a month near El Zonte, and then we stayed for a month in the mountains in Comasagua. And both of the stays were fantastic. And we met a great community of people, and the locals were like warm and welcoming to us, and we just fell in love with the place. It's stunningly beautiful, like the mountains along the coast, the volcanoes, it's like lush and green everywhere. And we fell in love with the country and decided that we wanted to get residency here and stay longer term. So we came back in September to live here now, and we've been here. So almost 4 months we've been living in El Salvador.
Después de lo que usted acaba de escuchar, saque sus propias conclusiones de verdad de lo que está sucediendo en otros países. Y debemos tener noción realmente de las cosas tan maravillosas que en este momento están pasando en El Salvador y por el buen camino que en este momento pasa nuestro país y nuestra sociedad en general. Vamos con el segundo testimonio, Ryan, que pues definitivamente también les va a dejar en qué pensar sobre los demás países y lo que está sucediendo en los mal llamados países de primer mundo.
First of all, what drives a Canadian to leave his country? You know, a developed country.
Right, a developed country. Yeah. So, you know, developed countries throughout history, they've all peaked at one time or another. And when they eventually peak, they start to deteriorate. And some time ago, my wife and I, we noticed that our country was starting to deteriorate. And what I mean by that is that economic freedom was beginning to contract. Personal freedoms were beginning to contract, get smaller and shrink all the time, every day. And what really did it for us was when we woke up one morning to discover that the federal government had froze our bank accounts. This made us unable to buy groceries, to put fuel in the car, to pay our phone bills, to really function or participate in Canadian society in any way, shape, or form. And even though that measure was undone just 2 days later, the damage was done from our point of view. We felt betrayed, and we felt like we could never really trust or feel secure in that country ever again. So that got us thinking, and it got us looking around the world to where is a country that is improving, not deteriorating, but getting better. And after looking at several different options, eventually we noticed and saw that El Salvador stood out as a country where economic liberty is expanding and personal freedoms are expanding. And even though El Salvador, it may not be a perfect country, there is no perfect country. And even though it's not Dubai or New York City or Tokyo, where it has all the luxuries and whiz-bang technology of those places, it is heading in an extremely positive and exciting direction, and we're just thrilled to be here and be part of it.
Why did you choose El Salvador? And it's nice to see that you guys have found like what you were looking for, liberty and a way of living life according to your values.
That's right,
So,
yeah.
do you have any extra ideas or things that you observed from El Salvador that made you take the decision?
Right. Well, you know, there are some things that we discovered after we got here that if we had known back in Canada, we would have been even more enthusiastic and motivated to move here. And of those, the one that sticks out the most is that this is a country that has its values intact. It's a country where family values are forefront, they're at the priority. It's a place where taking care of your friends and family and community are important parts of day-to-day life. And it might sound strange to say, but that is increasingly becoming an alien concept back in Canada, where, and I don't want to speak as though all Canadians are the same way, but a trend that is emerging is every man and woman for himself, self-censor, watch what you say, get in line with the government edicts, or else. It's become a very kind of gladiator arena sort of country, and we didn't really fully appreciate just how hard that was on our hearts until we got here and saw a country where there's just so much warmth, so much welcoming, so much readiness to help, and to form bonds with people. We can't even speak the same language, and we're forming stronger bonds than we formed back home in Canada. So it's been wonderful.
Recently, the Canadian government published a travel advice to visit El Salvador, telling its citizens to exercise a high degree of caution in El Salvador due to a high rate of violent crime. What do you think about that? And from your experience here, is El Salvador as dangerous as described in the travel advice?
Well, you know, it's funny you should bring that up, because we looked at the travel advisory as it was before we left Canada in July of 2022. And we've looked at the revision that has happened just a few days ago now. And what's bizarre about it is that the new version of the travel advisory actually makes the country sound even worse than the earlier travel advisory. And in that time, the country has only become safer and cleaner and more secure and better. So this was really bizarre to look at. And another thing that stands out about the travel advisory is that it seems to contain a lot of carefully chosen and well selected and crafted half-truths. There's no outright lies in the travel advisory, but all the truths are kind of half-truths that are put together in such a way as to paint a picture of El Salvador that at the end just doesn't correspond with reality at all. So honestly, I would say that we feel in our day-to-day life, we feel safer and more secure here in El Salvador than we did back home in Canada. And statistically right now, in terms of violent crime, you are more likely to be a victim of violent crime in the greater Toronto area than you are in El Salvador, and there's a similar population there. So I read the advisory and I couldn't help but wonder, why is it like this? Why is it seemingly trying to frighten and scare Canadians away from El Salvador? And then I thought, well, El Salvador is a place where liberties are expanding, and maybe that has something to do with it, but I don't really know.
Ryan, what would be your personal advice to Canadians out there, and in general to all travelers who want to know about El Salvador or move here?
Right. So the advice to anyone thinking about El Salvador is, well, if you're bold and brave to the extreme, like my wife and I were, and we just made the leap and came here as a move permanently one way, that's awesome if you can do that, and we encourage you, and we'll be here to say hello, and we'll help you out in any way we can. For everyone else, come see the country. You have nothing to fear here. You'll get out of the airport and you'll be immediately struck by how warm and beautiful the country is. And you'll be taken by the nature, the birds, the sea, the ocean. and you won't find yourself in any difficult or dangerous situations upon arrival. If you're like us, you're going to fall in love with the country almost instantly, and come see for yourself, verify for yourself that what I and other expats are saying about El Salvador is really true, and that this is a place where you can raise a family if you like. So I would say, you know, if your heart is telling you to come see El Salvador and find out what it has to offer you.
Como le digo siempre en repetidas ocasiones, de verdad, no me crean a mí, diríjanse ustedes mismos a las pruebas, a lo que ustedes están viendo, y si tienen la oportunidad de encontrar a alguien en la calle y preguntarle sobre lo que ellos mismos piensan, háganlo. De verdad que es para que ustedes se den cuenta de lo que está sucediendo en el país. Vámonos con el tercer testimonio, que pues nos relata prácticamente la misma historia. De verdad que es impactante saber que ahora la gente, debido a esas malas decisiones que están tomando otros países, deciden migrar a países como el nuestro, que ahora están caminando por el camino correcto.
What drives a Canadian to leave his country, a developed country?
Well, Canada was a wonderful country, but recently the sense of freedom, of personal freedom, was lost, and I couldn't agree with the diversity that the Canadian government was trying to impose upon the people. They were trying hard to create a separation between groups of people. So that bothered me, and then it went even further. So one day I just said enough and packed 2 suitcases and left. So El Salvador was on my places to visit for a couple of years now because of Bitcoin, and I wanted to see what's going on at Bitcoin Beach. But when things escalated in Canada and all over the world, it made me think that El Salvador might be the safest place for the future in terms of personal financial safety. Before I came to El Salvador, I was worried as well because I've heard all these advisories and warnings. I read the Government of Canada's website, the warnings there. But I also listened to a lot of YouTubers that actually live here. I've also, I'm following President Bukele on Twitter. I'm following people like Max Kaiser and Stacy, and I hear from people who have feet on the ground what's going on here. And that gave me the confidence to actually come here. I came here alone, by the way, meaning that in a perspective, to put things in perspective, I'm a woman traveling alone, and I came to a country that I do not speak the language, which is scary by itself, and also all the things that we hear about El Salvador or in the past. But I did know that a lot of changes have occurred, and that gave me the confidence to actually come here alone. At the beginning I was still wary, you know, I didn't want to travel at night, and I booked the hotel next to the airport and started asking the driver, who I arranged in advance because I didn't want to take a taxi or an Uber. I asked him how things were, and do I really need to be careful? Do I really need to put the money in a pants belt, or hide my purse under my shirt like people told me to do? And he said, no, there's not an issue at all. And from the next day on, I can tell you that I was walking freely, happily. I felt no danger. I've been here for 2 months, I'm driving alone at night, going back and forth from events and friends and meeting new people. Absolutely feel safe as if I'm in my own country.
Y ahí lo tienen. Ya lo escucharon ustedes mismos de los actores principales, de las personas que han vivido eso de primera mano, que son las mejores personas que nos pueden hablar al respecto. No soy yo el que les va a venir a decir qué es lo que tal vez pienso que puede que esté pasando en otro país, sino que son las mismas personas quienes ya, pues acá en El Salvador, ya en sus casas, con sus familias, esperando incluso que la generación anterior a ellos en su país también vengan a El Salvador a establecerse, esté marcando una gran pauta de lo que está sucediendo en el país, y no únicamente para los canadienses. Y este era el caso, pues, porque vimos al principio de año que el mismo gobierno de Canadá mostró un aviso a los viajeros advirtiendo de lo peligroso que podía ser visitar El Salvador, cuando en años anteriores los mismos salvadoreños, y eso nadie más nos puede venir a decir, nosotros mismos sabíamos que antes era muchísimo más peligroso vivir en El Salvador de lo que es ahora. Ahí tienen las conclusiones que han sacado los mismos canadienses, que prácticamente están tratando pues de retener a la gente para que no se vaya del país, y es entendible, ningún país quiere que su gente se vaya, pero en El Salvador era pues totalmente lo contrario. Parecía que los gobiernos hacían todo lo posible para que los salvadoreños se fueran del país. Ahora no únicamente se están quedando los salvadoreños, que pues con ese dinero que antes utilizaban tal vez para el coyote, para irse de forma ilegal, ahora lo están utilizando para poner un negocio, porque es seguro hacerlo. Y no solo los salvadoreños se están quedando, sino que personas de otros países ahora vienen a El Salvador porque creen que El Salvador está haciendo las cosas bien y no se equivocan. De verdad que somos los mismos salvadoreños quienes vemos que las cosas están saliendo bien. Ellos también están confiando en El Salvador, están invirtiendo acá, y no queda más que pues continuar y darle seguimiento a lo que sucede en El Salvador y defender lo que hemos logrado todos los salvadoreños juntos, porque este es un logro de todos los buenos salvadoreños que queremos lo mejor para nuestro país.